I want to just back up a little bit and touch on something that you were just talking about. Pushback in the academic world and pressure that's put on people. It reminds me a lot of, one of the more prominent names that jumps to mind is John Mack at Harvard, who was famously dragged over broken glass for all intents and purposes, just for taking the idea of abductions seriously. This has been going on for quite some time, and it doesn't look like it's slowed down at all. But there does seem to be a faction that wants to push disclosure forward. What's your take on the situation, the state of play right now?
Okay, John Mack. This is his book, Abduction. Now, he was a Pulitzer Prize-winning author. He wrote the autobiography, not the biography of T. Lawrence of Arabia. He was the founder of his department at the Harvard Hospital in psychiatry. He was stellar. You couldn't get higher. And he came out with that book. It was the same thing as when I came out. They had to get rid of him. There had to be a huge controversy. Anyway, I'm not saying that the professors did this because they were knowingly working with intel people. However, John Mack went through hell as the University Senate at Harvard. They tried to get rid of him. They tried to remove his tenure. Mind you, he was founder of his department, Pulitzer Prize-winning author. You can't get better. They tried to get rid of his tenure, to get rid of him. On a phone call that I had with him, he actually asked me if I knew any contributors, like moneyed people, that could help him with his legal expenses. He fought to try to keep his job at Harvard. And finally, basically it was because of an article in the local press that apparently Alan Dershowitz wrote, saying Harvard was violating his tenure. It was also his constitutional right for free speech. Anyway, a week later or so, the dean just closed it up and say, John Mack can do whatever he wants. We're closing the book on that. But no one offered to pay his few $100,000 of legal bills. Harvard never offered to reimburse that.
Well, and at the same time, too, it's important for people to understand, particularly people who are maybe too young to remember this period, but on television, and I remember this very well, I wonder what your take is, they would bring, John Mack in particular, would bring people who had claimed to be abductees onto these interview talk shows like Oprah Winfrey or whatever, and they would tell about their experiences. Dr. Mack would try to walk people through his process and what was going on. And these people were laughed at. They were ridiculed. I mean, on national television in broad daylight, it was really disgusting to watch. What did you make of that cultural sort of response? Or, was that orchestrated to kind of dampen the conversation down on this?
One of the people
of his prestige,
I can't prove this, of course, but it's obvious to me that none of this stuff is accidental.
Yeah.
So one of the people that got involved in John Mack's studies, he did not include in his book. He did not include this lady in his book. But it turned out that she was a plant, and her whole purpose, and she admitted this afterwards and tried to discredit him afterwards, was to discredit his process. And after the book came out, she said, I was involved in that thing, and I just gave him junk that I just said. None of it was true, and they listened to it and stuff like that. Now, fortunately, he did not include any of that in his book. But that's a clear case of people trying in advance to set it up, before the fact. And so academics have a tough time. Now, another person I know it was David Jacobs. Now, David M. Jacobs, this is one of his books he did, and he also focused on abduction stuff. So David M. Jacobs did this Walking Among Us. That's his last book. He's retired now. He was a professor at Temple. And, he never got promoted to full professor. And I, for example, have not been promoted to full professor at Emory. And I won't go into any of that right now. But, the issue is they tried to get rid of John Mack's tenure. I came out with my stuff with remote viewing after I'd already had tenure. And David M. Jacobs, he had tenure at Temple. But, we never got beyond that. But at least we were tenured and couldn't be fired easily. Those are warning shots for any other academic that wants to talk about this. I am the only surviving academic Well, David M. Jacobs is still alive, but in terms of still working in the academy,
right?
I am the only surviving academic that talks about any of this stuff. There are no courses in any university, I believe worldwide, talking about the UAP or UFO phenomena. There are no courses talking about the extraterrestrials. There are no courses talking about remote viewing. There's no courses talking about any of this stuff. Yet they still have congressional hearings with David Grush and others, Lou Elizondo, talking about the crash retrieval program. And David Grush, for example, when he did the congressional hearings, he still had worked at the Pentagon and still had his he still had his Pentagon security clearance. That means that there was an office. He never told anything to Congress that the Pentagon didn't formally allow him to say. That meant his office wanted to get the information out and gave him formal permission, written permission to speak, to say X, Y, and Z in those congressional hearings. There was another office down the hall that said, we don't know anything about it. There's no extraterrestrials. There's no UFOs. It's all garbage. So you can see that the Pentagon is split. One is giving formal written permission to people like David Grush to do congressional hearings, and the other office is denying the entire thing. So you can see that the military has split. And so what we have is a situation in which academics look at that and say, I'm not going to walk into this thing. They know that if they do, they're going to run into the same problems that John Mack ran into, that David M. Jacobs ran into, and that I ran into. And don't make a mistake of thinking that an academic is smart enough to evade this stuff. Remember, I was ranked very highly on the gullibility scale by military intelligence. Academics have absolutely no training for circumventing this type of trap.
There was a great interview very recently with Diana Pasulka in the New York Times, and she even said in that interview, I'm paraphrasing, but she said, I knew from talking to Jacques Vallée and others that I was probably identified as someone who could spread misinformation, who would be really effective at that. And she was on guard. Everybody she dealt with, she didn't know what their game was, what they were trying to do. These are all intelligence community people. You just don't know. And she, was just trying to write a book about all of this, and she just couldn't navigate that minefield very easily. And I think that speaks to your point.
Yeah, I have been in scientific meetings, trying to present this stuff, and I ran into military intelligence people who I knew. They were card carrying. I knew who they were. They were not secret.
No question about it.
Yeah. No question about it. And they actively, one in particular, but a few of them, they actively combated me. And one time, in one particular meeting, I was a member of the board of the Society for Scientific Exploration, and I was actually presenting to the board a way that we can make our stuff better by including video in our presentations and so on. The guy came up with every type of objection possible, but I kept on going. He finally ended up, when all else fails, is just to make noise. He ended up just laughing. He's just squelching my entire presentation, so I couldn't do it because he was screeching at the end of the table, at the end of the boardroom, and I couldn't present anything. And so, their job is to disrupt this kind of thing and to not let this stuff get out and they have people placed in these organizations to make sure nothing gets out.
I want to hit you now with probably the most challenging question that I can ask you.
Okay.
Because we have about 10 minutes for this question, and then I want to ask you a kind of a wrap-up question, and I want to be respectful of your time. Here's my challenging question. What is the situation in which humanity finds itself right now?
This really deserves a part 2.
I want you to tee up a part 2. I'm going to hit you up for a part 2 after this. But the reason I'm asking it this way is because I wanted to sort of establish the lay of the land of what you're up against, the type of work that you do, why it is so significant, and how it reveals information that people are completely blind to. You've basically identified and described a completely different world than what people think is actually going on. And if you could you try to touch on that? Just give us a brief idea.
Okay, I'll give you the shortest possible.
I know it's not easy.
No, I can summarize it in just a couple of minutes, but then it's going to raise so many other questions. This planet is being run as a prison. Now, that's not an analogy or a metaphor, literally a prison. The ETs that have written agreements with the United States government and Google, Haim Eshed, the director of the Israeli space program, you can get it, you can find it on Google. The ETs that have written agreements with the United States government that include secrecy and everything like that, they are doing really bad stuff. They have their own programs here, but they had to be given written formal approval to do it because there's another group of extraterrestrials, the ones that are on my side, the ones that we work with, that we call the good ETs. And they don't like it when I say this, but essentially they're free will fanatics, meaning they have the military capability to dispense with the bad ETs, but they can't do anything unless humanity agrees in some way. The bad ETs have all of the political leadership, much of the military leadership, and all of the corporate, everybody, all locked up through various means, through mental manipulation, bribery, everything you can possibly imagine. And yes, probably the Epstein thing falls into that somehow as well. But they've got it all locked up. And the only way that this can be broken is to collapse the information control system on this planet. Because you can see you're talking to me, and this is a lot of new information coming to you, and you're probably asking, your viewers are asking, why haven't I been hearing about it? Well, why are we shadow banned on Google? Why are we shadow banned on YouTube? Why did the whole Hale-Bopp thing happen? Why do other scandals happen? Why did John Mack and David M. Jacobs have their problem? The issue is it's so heavily controlled. To give you an example, November we have actually board meetings where all the people at Farsight meet in our boardroom, and two extraterrestrials, and sometimes there's a third around the back, but two extraterrestrials physically show up and they talk to us. And we have communications that we record on video and we publish on YouTube as well as on farsightprime.com.
You say physically show up. Just what do you mean by that?
We can see them perfectly clear because we had done the remote viewing thing where our minds are capable of seeing them, but you wouldn't be able to see them, but they're physically there. And everybody detects the exact same people. And they're different people each time. Sometimes we've had military people come by, we've had social scientists come by, we've had an AI come by, we've had two AIs come by, we've had a gray, and then most of them are humanoid types, but they come by and they talk to us. The basic idea that we're been told is that the Farsight library on farsightprime.com, they were the ones who got it there. They told us what to do. This is another episode we'll have to cover. They told us what to do, the whole step. I'd like to take credit for everything. Just say Courtney's a genius. He created all. Honestly, Clint, they told us what to do. We did it. The library is what it is because it's the only verifiable, clean record with no bias of what the real history of humanity, including political scandals, actually is. It's the only one. Everything else is he said, she said stuff that's manipulated by the controllers. So the process now is on one of our board meetings on November 13th, they told us, we're going to do something new, guys. We're going to show up with ships all over the place, all over the world, and we're not going to have any cloaking technology. You'll be able to do it. So just tell everybody to go out with their cell phones and everything else, and you'll be start in a few days. We published it on November 15th. On November 18th, the so-called drone thing exploded worldwide. And then the military and the U.S. government was hilarious. The first thing the Pentagon did was to say, well, first thing they said is, we don't know who that is or what they are. Second thing they said was they were an Iranian mothership off the coast of New Jersey that was launching these things. And then that only lasted for 2 hours, and the Pentagon officially took it down. A couple of weeks later, they said it was a Chinese mothership, and that got a little traction. It even got onto the Sean Ryan podcast. And then President Trump later said, no, these are all experimental aircraft authorized by the FAA. Now, that's crazy because the FAA doesn't have any jurisdiction over the world, and they were worldwide. They were not over just New Jersey or anything. And the ships had no heat signature, no transponder, which was absolutely legally required for any human ship. And they were flying over restricted airspaces all over the place. Washington, they were all over military bases, nuclear facilities, everything. They were flying everywhere. And it was nonstop. Everybody had cameras out and they were all taking pictures of them. And then come around January, it stopped. And when President Trump said they were just FAA experimental aircraft, the whole story went away. To this day, it's like it never happened. And then in another board meeting, they told us, no, the reason we did that is everybody was saying, just show up with your ships, have disclosure, just show up with the ship. And we had to show you that it didn't matter what ships we showed up with. We came up with thousands of our ships. And to this day, it just blasted out. So just showing up with the ships is not enough. You have to completely collapse the information control system first, and then we can talk. And then we have the ability. People will then stop the hypnotic trance between them and the leadership that they're seeing on their TV screens, and they will look at us. And we will circumvent the entire leadership and we'll talk and explain things. And then the people, the masses, can make a free will decision to want to align to us because we want to help. And as soon as that free will decision happens, they can intervene. They have the military capability to swamp the bad ETs. But the bad ETs know that they won't do that unless there's a free will decision. So that's what's trying to be stopped. They're trying to stop disclosure so that there will be no free will decision that would invite the free will ETs to come in and fix everything. That's the bottom line. So what you're seeing now with these crises all over the world that are happening, they're going to boil out of control. It's going to become a really bad situation economically, militarily. There's going to be a complete collapse of the entire system. And it's by design. It's got to happen. It's the only way the truth can actually come out. And when that happens, everybody on the planet is going to be saying, well, what's really going on? That's why the FarsightPrime.com video library exists. That's why the Vault now exists, so people can talk about it with their AIs. It's to answer all the questions that everyone is going to want to have answers to, because they're going to finally realize that the authorities have been lying through their butts going back to the beginning of time, and they want to know the actual truth. So that's why we built all of this infrastructure. And it's not like just me. I couldn't have done all this by myself. Are you serious? And so, but that's another whole story. That whole FarsightPrime.com, everything is basically an ET thing.
So is it a fair comparison to say it's like we're living in North Korea? It's like being born there. We don't know anything about the outside world except what they tell us, and everything they tell us is propaganda.
Everything.
So when you watch the news, you're getting what the Defense Department filtered through their CIA people at CNN, and then it goes on the air and it's scripted to a certain way.
But don't blame the Defense Department entirely. The Defense Department is split. I don't know what the actual percentages are, but let's say half. Half of them really want this disclosure thing happen. Half of them do not want the continuation of what's been going on. They want this openness, but ultimately there's got to be political decisions that push this in one direction or the other. The military can't do this by themselves. So don't pile up any anger on the military. They're between a rock and a hard place.
But to your point, the information that we're getting, whether it's through someone's, the reporter's personal political biases or the chain of information as it moves through the system, getting changed a little bit each time, your method of taking 4-5 different remote viewers, double blind, they're seeing the same thing. They're writing it all down. The data goes into an AI, it gets analyzed, and you come back with what you're saying is clean information. And that clean information, that picture that we see when we look at that information is of a completely different situation than what we think we're in. And it's when I've heard you explain it in the past, and because I've watched a number of different interviews that you've done, you can see why they don't tell people. It's like it is a tough pill to swallow.
Yeah, but
how do you even explain this to, you know what I mean? Like
they don't make the mistake of thinking they don't tell people because it's too hard for people to grasp. That's not what's going on. They don't tell people because they don't want people to know. It's not too hard to grasp. The good ETs have been, the crises that we're seeing happening were originally designed by the bad ETs as part of the control process to keep humanity in a constant state of low boil. One crisis after the next, and stretched out over 20 or 30 years. The good ETs that we work with, they're responsible for taking those crises. They didn't create the crises, but they crunched them in time so that they all happen at the same time. That's why you get the European situation boiling out of control, the Middle East situation boiling out of control. Very likely, China and Taiwan situation is going to boil out. You're going to see worldwide, and also the enemies of the United States know damn well that they're not going to be able to defend themselves against the U.S. unless they do something domestically within the U.S. The U.S. has always been protected by the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. Europe is vulnerable. Things can happen. Asia is vulnerable. But the enemies of the U.S. now know that they're going to have to do something inside the United States. And a lot of stuff has gone on. During the 4 years during the Biden administration, there was Biden and Harris administration, you had 10 to 14 million people just walk across the border completely unvetted. And you know, the level of drugs that they bring in that feed the drug culture in the United States, that has to be carried with like 18-wheelers and stuff. Those aren't carried by a guy with a backpack.
So there's like an effort to destabilize from within.
That's exactly right. And what basically had happened is when that happened, the enemies of the United States took advantage of that and they slipped in few thousand of their operatives. So we know that a number of Al-Qaeda operatives have gotten in the United States, and we know that Iranian operatives are in the United States. In addition, they were able to bring in heavy weapons, including missiles and stuff like that. I mean, if you could bring in 18-wheelers of drugs, you could bring in anything. And during that time period, there was no brakes. There was nothing stopping crossing the border. So if you're an enemy of the United States, wouldn't you take advantage of that? And so they did that. And so the real question is, they now have sleeper cells. They don't want to be caught by ICE, so they just hunker down. So the real question is, if there is a confrontation between the United States and other people, are we going to be protected by the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean?